Why don't you let her go? She's got nothing to do with this.
You mean now I can carry him just because I was worried about you?
You are so beautiful.
The 1980s gave us some of the greatest blockbusters of all time, and also some of the biggest cinematic disasters Hollywood would rather you forget. For every Back to the Future, there was a Howard the Duck. For every E.T., there was a Krull. These movies had big budgets, big stars, and even bigger hype, yet they crashed harder than a DeLorean at 88 miles per hour. So, join us today as we explore 25 forgotten movies from the 1980s that failed miserably. Few films in Hollywood history carry the reputation of being so disastrous that they nearly killed a studio. But Heaven's Gate holds that infamous honor. Directed by Michael Cimino, fresh off his Oscar-winning triumph, The Deer Hunter, this sprawling Western cost an astronomical $44 million, an unheard-of sum in 1980. With endless delays, extravagant sets, and meticulous retakes, the production spiraled out of control. When released, critics tore it apart for being bloated, confusing, and pretentious. Its failure bankrupted United Artists, sending shockwaves through the industry. Ironically, years later, some critics reappraised it as an ambitious but misunderstood epic. Still, at the time, it was the poster child for Hollywood excess and remains one of cinema's most notorious flops. If one movie could bring down a studio, what would Steve McQueen's swan song bring to the screen?
Why don't you let her go? She's got nothing to do with this.
I'm gonna kill you, and she's gonna watch.
They sent you to prison. I just picked you up, pal.
In stark contrast to the grand failures of big-budget spectacles, The Hunter failed for far more sobering reasons. This modest action drama is remembered mainly as Steve McQueen's final screen role before his untimely death from cancer later that year. Playing real-life bounty hunter Ralph "Papa" Thorson, McQueen chases fugitives across the Midwest while juggling a troubled personal life. Sadly, the film never connected with critics or audiences, criticized for its uneven tone, flat pacing, and lackluster script. McQueen's performance, subdued due to his declining health, lacked the vitality of his earlier career-defining roles. Although it grossed some money, it fell far short of expectations and became an underwhelming farewell for one of Hollywood's greatest action icons.
It's incredible.
Not every expensive film disaster involves overindulgent directors. Sometimes it's simply a bad idea. Raise the Titanic tried to adapt Clive Cussler's popular adventure novel into a sweeping Cold War thriller, but its ambition outstripped both technology and storytelling. With a production budget of around $40 million, the filmmakers constructed massive sets and even full-scale replicas of the Titanic, hoping to create spectacle. The result? A stiff, boring movie where little happens beyond talking and bad special effects. Audiences stayed away, critics mocked it, and Cussler himself disowned the adaptation. It earned back barely a fraction of its costs and became a legendary box office bomb. One reviewer summed it up best: "It would have been cheaper to lower the Atlantic." When a shipwreck couldn't stay afloat, could Robin Williams' oddball sailor carry the weight instead?
You mean now I can carry him just because I was worried about you?
Yes.
Fui.
When Robin Williams stepped into the cinema for the first time, nobody expected his debut to be as bizarre as Popeye. Directed by Robert Altman and co-starring Shelley Duvall as Olive Oyl, the film was a live-action musical based on the classic cartoon sailor. Produced by Paramount and Disney, the studios poured millions into building an entire seaside village set in Malta, which still exists today as a tourist attraction. Unfortunately, the film's strange tone, mumbling dialogue, and awkward musical numbers confused audiences and critics alike. While it managed to scrape a modest profit, it was labeled a creative disaster. Williams himself admitted he hated the experience, and Popeye has remained more of a Hollywood curiosity than a beloved classic.
The tick law does not qualify for an exit based on our demographic analyzation. You're just too small!
If there was ever proof that throwing money at a comedy doesn't guarantee laughs, Honky Tonk Freeway is it. Directed by John Schlesinger, an Academy Award-winning filmmaker, this ensemble farce revolved around a Florida town desperate to attract tourists. To sell the illusion, the production literally painted an entire town pink, a stunt as absurd as the script itself. With a budget soaring to nearly $24 million, the studio expected a quirky box office hit, but the movie was universally panned. Critics derided it as painfully unfunny, disjointed, and overly chaotic. Its theatrical run barely earned back $2 million, making it one of the most humiliating failures of the decade. Today, it's remembered only as a cautionary tale of misplaced ambition. Every generation gets its attempt to revive classic heroes, but the legend of the Lone Ranger proved that not every mask fits. The film sought to reboot the beloved 1930s to 1950s radio and TV cowboy for a modern audience, casting Clinton Spilsbury in his first and only film role. Unfortunately, Spilsbury was so wooden that his lines had to be dubbed entirely by another actor, leaving the hero lifeless. To make matters worse, the studio alienated longtime fans by suing Clayton Moore, the original Lone Ranger, to stop him from appearing in costume at promotional events. Critics dismissed the movie as dull, joyless, and derivative, while audiences stayed away. Despite a hefty budget, the film bombed and killed the franchise for decades. If a cowboy couldn't save the day, could a pair of robots manage to win hearts?
Sanitation engineer Russell Percival Wyatt told me to, quote,
Get your ass over here and help.
end of quote.
Sometimes a movie sounds quirky on paper but collapses on screen, and Heart Beeps is the perfect example. Starring comedian Andy Kaufman and Bernadette Peters, the film told the story of two robots who fall in love and dream of raising a family. Universal poured money into special makeup effects, even earning an Oscar nomination for Rick Baker's designs, but the movie itself was a lifeless slog. Kaufman, known for his eccentric humor, seemed uncomfortable in the role, while critics blasted the film for being dull and sentimentally forced. With a box office gross of less than $2 million against a $12 million budget, Heart Beeps was an unmitigated disaster and quickly disappeared into obscurity.
In a land torn by conflict, Jacqueline Bissett is the woman who has never known war.
War epics usually thrive on authenticity and powerful storytelling, but Inchon became infamous for neither. Backed by the controversial religious leader Sun Myung Moon and costing nearly $46 million, this retelling of General Douglas MacArthur's Korean War landing starred Laurence Olivier, Jacqueline Bisset, and Ben Gazzara. Production was plagued by delays, rewrites, and bizarre interference from financiers who treated it as both propaganda and spectacle. When the film finally limped into theaters, critics savaged it as incoherent, overly melodramatic, and historically dubious. Even Olivier's performance was mocked as one of his worst. With a meager return of around $5 million, Inchon ranks as one of the biggest flops of the 1980s and remains a legendary cinematic miscalculation. The 1980s were littered with strange attempts at sci-fi action, but few reached the absurd heights of Megaforce. Directed by Hal Needham, best known for Smokey and the Bandit, the film featured a futuristic paramilitary team in golden spandex suits battling an evil dictator. Starring Barry Bostwick with a blonde mane and endless campy one-liners, the movie leaned heavily on toy-like vehicles, cheesy effects, and patriotic bravado. The producers hoped it would launch a franchise, complete with merchandise and sequels, but audiences burst out laughing for all the wrong reasons. Critics ridiculed it as unintentionally hilarious, shallow, and cheaply made. Its failure was so complete that Megaforce became a cult joke rather than the blockbuster its creators envisioned.
Hi, Jen.
Hi.
Where's Rob?
He wasn't feeling too well, so we had to go home.
You seem a lot more mature than that punk kid you were with.
Buzz off, pal, okay?
Teen sex comedies dominated the early 80s, but Zapped proved that not every raunchy idea was destined for success. Starring Scott Baio and Willie Ames, the plot revolved around a nerdy high schooler who accidentally gains telekinetic powers and promptly uses them for mischief, mostly involving removing women's clothing. Even by the low standards of the genre, the movie was panned as tasteless, juvenile, and poorly executed. Critics dismissed its writing as lazy and its humor as cringeworthy, while audiences found better laughs in rival comedies like Porky's. Though it eventually gained a small cult following for its camp factor, Zapped failed at the box office and left its stars embarrassed by the project for years afterward. What happens when you blend cavemen, dinosaurs, aliens, and laser guns into one movie? You get Yor, the Hunter from the future. An Italian-Turkish co-production loosely adapted from a comic book, the film starred Reb Brown as a blonde, muscular warrior wandering a prehistoric wasteland. Things start off like a standard caveman adventure, but halfway through, Yor suddenly battles futuristic robots, making the plot utterly incoherent. Special effects looked cheap, the dialogue was clunky, and critics laughed at its unintentional campiness. Though it briefly aired on TV as a miniseries, the theatrical cut performed poorly worldwide. Over time, Yor became a cult oddity, remembered more for its cheesy theme song than for any genuine cinematic achievement. After low-budget prehistoric sci-fi, might a flashy fantasy epic win the throne? In an era obsessed with space operas and fantasy adventures, Columbia Pictures gambled big on Krull, hoping it would become the next Star Wars or Lord of the Rings. Directed by Peter Yates, the movie told the story of Prince Colwyn on a quest to rescue his bride from a cosmic villain known as the Beast. The film featured elaborate sets, imaginative creatures, and the iconic throwing weapon called the glaive. Despite a hefty $47 million budget, Krull flopped at the box office, grossing only a fraction of its cost. Critics blasted it as derivative and sluggish, while audiences ignored it. Although it later gained cult fans who admire its ambition, Krull remains one of the most expensive failures of its decade.
Father! Father!
Mythology has inspired countless adaptations, but the 1983 Hercules starring Lou Ferrigno stands out for all the wrong reasons. Produced in Italy by Cannon Films, the movie attempted to cash in on the sword and sorcery craze popularized by Conan the Barbarian. Unfortunately, budget limitations and campy direction turned it into a laughable spectacle. Featuring bizarre sequences of Hercules fighting giant robots, tossing bears into outer space, and battling glowing monsters, the film felt more like bad science fiction than mythology. Ferrigno, fresh off his fame as TV's Incredible Hulk, looked the part but struggled with the awkward dialogue. Critics derided it as unintentionally funny, and audiences stayed away. Still, its sheer absurdity earned it a cult following among fans of so bad it's good cinema. When mythological brawn fell flat, could even the world's greatest superhero keep flying high?
My God, they're trapped!
After the massive success of Superman and its sequel, audiences had high hopes for Superman 3. Instead, they got a film that veered into slapstick comedy. sidelining the Man of Steel in favor of comic routines by Richard Pryor. Director Richard Lester leaned on gags and goofy special effects, producing scenes like an evil Superman drunk in a bar. While Christopher Reeve still shone as Clark Kent, the movie's inconsistent tone, weak villain, and bloated runtime disappointed both critics and fans. At the box office, it earned less than its predecessors, signaling franchise fatigue. Though not a total financial disaster, it was a critical flop, damaging Superman's cinematic reputation until the even worse Superman 4.
Purushadam IV. There are guild highliners above us containing many great houses of the Landsrad. Send them back.
How dare you speak to me?
Frank Herbert's beloved novel Dune was long considered unfilmable, and David Lynch's 1984 adaptation proved why. With a sprawling cast including Kyle MacLachlan, Patrick Stewart, and Sting, Universal Pictures spent upwards of $40 million hoping for a sci-fi blockbuster to rival Star Wars. Instead, the film collapsed under the weight of confusing exposition, erratic pacing, and dense world-building. Studio interference forced Lynch to condense the sprawling novel into a muddled 2-hour epic, leading audiences to walk away baffled. Critics trashed it as incoherent and pretentious, while fans of the book called it a betrayal. Though a cult following later embraced its strange visuals and haunting atmosphere, Dune was a costly disappointment upon release and a black mark on Lynch's career.
It's the third truck from the front, the one with the iron drums.
I see it. Get your flame ready.
Comic book heroines were rare on the big screen in the 1980s, and Sheena tried to fill that gap with disastrous results. Based on the 1930s comic strip Jungle Queen, the film starred Tanya Roberts as the titular heroine, a blonde woman raised in Africa who could communicate with animals. Columbia Pictures spent around $25 million on exotic locations and elaborate sets, but what hit theaters was a clumsy mix of camp, poor acting, and an incoherent script. Critics mocked its wooden performances and exploitative tone, while audiences ignored it almost entirely. The movie grossed under $6 million domestically, making it a box office embarrassment. Today, Sheena is remembered mostly as a misguided attempt to cash in on fantasy adventure trends.
4, 3, 2.
Few films better illustrate the danger of being too weird for your own good than the adventures of Buckaroo Banzai across the eighth dimension. Combining sci-fi, comedy, adventure, and surrealism, the movie starred Peter Weller as a rock star brain surgeon who leads a team of eccentric heroes against alien invaders. Despite a strong cast featuring Ellen Barkin, Jeff Goldblum, and John Lithgow, audiences had no idea how to process its bizarre tone and chaotic plot. The marketing failed to explain what the film even was, and its box office returns were dismal. Though it later developed a cult following, complete with comic book spin-offs and fan conventions, Buckaroo Banzai was a commercial failure upon release and baffled mainstream moviegoers. Sword and sorcery films were booming after Conan the Barbarian, so producers tried to expand the universe with Red Sonja. Brigitte Nielsen starred as the Fiery Warrior, while Arnold Schwarzenegger appeared in what was marketed as a co-leading role, though his character was never Conan by name. Unfortunately, the film suffered from a weak script, clumsy dialogue, and uninspired direction. Critics panned it as lifeless and wooden, while Nielsen's performance was widely ridiculed. Despite heavy promotion, the movie bombed at the box office, pulling in just a fraction of its budget. Schwarzenegger later joked that it was so bad he used it as punishment for his kids when they misbehaved. Red Sonja quickly faded into obscurity, killing hopes of a sequel. If barbarian battles lacked bite, could a dreamy fantasy with Tom Cruise turn the tide?
Always go now? because I'll only be here for a short while.
Fantasy lovers might be shocked today to learn that Legend, directed by Ridley Scott and starring a young Tom Cruise, was considered a major flop on release. The film featured dazzling visuals, elaborate sets, and an unforgettable Tim Curry performance as the demonic villain, Darkness. However, the movie was plagued by production troubles, a delayed release, and studio interference that resulted in multiple cuts. Critics found the plot thin and overly reliant on spectacle, and American audiences stayed away, leaving it a commercial disappointment. Only later, with the release of Scott's preferred director's cut, did Legend gain a cult following for its dark fairy tale aesthetic. Still, in 1985, it was dismissed as another expensive misfire in the fantasy boom.
Across the sea of stars lies another world, a world almost exactly like ours. This is where he lives.
Few 1980s flops are as infamous as Howard the Duck. Produced by George Lucas, the movie attempted to bring Marvel's cigar-chomping duck from the comics to the big screen. Unfortunately, the bizarre mix of animatronic effects, awkward comedy, and uncomfortable romance between Howard and Lee Thompson made it a laughingstock. With a budget of $37 million, it was one of the most expensive comedies ever made at the time, yet it barely scraped $16 million domestically. Critics savaged the film for being incoherent and creepy, and audiences walked away confused. Despite its failure, Howard the Duck later achieved cult status as one of cinema's greatest so-bad-it's-good experiences. But in 1986, it stood as a career low for nearly everyone involved.
Best international currency in the world.
It's opium. Shanghai.
Celebrity power doesn't always translate into box office success, and Shanghai Surprise is the textbook case. Starring real-life couple Madonna and Sean Penn, the adventure romance was meant to showcase their chemistry against the backdrop of 1930s China. Instead, the production turned into a disaster, with constant rewrites, director clashes, and rumors of the star's diva behavior. Critics lambasted the film for its weak story, awkward performances, and lack of charm, calling it tedious rather than adventurous. The British-financed movie cost around $17 million but grossed less than $1 million in the US, making it a spectacular bomb. Madonna even won a Golden Raspberry Award for Worst Actress. The film has since been remembered more for gossip than for anything on screen.
Beautiful. You are so beautiful.
Don't kid me.
You probably had every guy in the world telling you you're beautiful ever since the day you were born.
You are so crazy, Hall.
Few titles in cinema history are as shorthand for failure as Ishtar. Directed by Elaine May and starring Dustin Hoffman and Warren Beatty, the comedy followed two bumbling lounge singers caught up in Cold War intrigue in the Middle East. With constant rewrites, production chaos in the Moroccan desert, and stars clashing over creative control, the film's budget ballooned to over $50 million. By the time it limped into theaters, critics had sharpened their knives, calling it painfully unfunny and self-indulgent. Audiences avoided it entirely, and it grossed only $14 million. The backlash was so intense that Ishtar became a punchline for Hollywood excess. Ironically, decades later, some critics have reappraised it, though its flop status remains unshakable. If one notorious failure became a punchline, could a gross-out kids flick sink even lower?
Hey, those little creeps are sure ugly.
Oh, yeah, I'll show you ugly.
Based on the wildly popular trading cards, the Garbage Pail Kids movie should have been a campy hit for kids. Instead, it became one of the most reviled films of the 1980s. Featuring grotesque animatronic puppets representing characters like Greaser Greg and Messy Tessie, the movie was marketed as a children's comedy but featured gross-out humor and disturbing imagery. The plot, involving kids teaming up with the Garbage Pail Gang to stop bullies and fashion criminals, was incoherent and joyless. Critics universally panned it as ugly, mean-spirited and terrifying for children. With a budget of $1 million, it grossed under that domestically vanishing almost instantly. Today, it frequently tops worst movies ever made lists, cementing its notorious legacy. Hoping to turn the wildly popular He-Man toy line into a blockbuster franchise, Cannon Films released Masters of the Universe. Starring Dolph Lundgren as He-Man and Frank Langella as Skeletor, the film abandoned much of the toy and cartoon lore, setting much of the action on Earth to save costs. Fans felt betrayed, and newcomers were baffled by the muddled story. With a $22 million budget, the special effects looked cheap, and Lundgren's heavy accent made his dialogue nearly unintelligible. Critics slammed the movie as a dull, uninspired cash grab. At the box office, it earned only $17 million, killing any hopes for a sequel. While later rediscovered as a cult oddity in 1987, it was a colossal disappointment. Ambition doesn't always equal success, and Terry Gilliam's The Adventures of Baron Munchausen proved that in spectacular fashion. Imagined as a surreal fantasy about the legendary German storyteller, the film featured elaborate sets, groundbreaking special effects, and a whimsical cast including John Neville, Uma Thurman, and Robin Williams. However, production spiraled out of control, with ballooning costs, logistical nightmares, and behind-the-scenes conflicts. Columbia Pictures reportedly spent over $45 million, but the marketing push was minimal due to studio leadership changes. The movie grossed less than $10 million worldwide. While critics praised its imagination and visual inventiveness, audiences stayed away. Over time, it gained cult appreciation, but in 1988, Baron Munchausen stood as one of the decade's most disastrous flops.